Today we're going to be discussing the Pacific. And the Pacific, of course, is named for the Pacific Ocean. So we'll be looking at cultures that are existing on the islands in the Pacific. You might also hear these cultures referred to as oceanic, the idea of ocean cultures, right? So you can use the Pacific, you can use oceanic, really doesn't matter. The Pacific, though, is usually the ones you see used most commonly today. Now you'll note that these islands lay in three areas: Melanesia, or the Black Islands, Micronesia, the Small Islands, and Polynesia, the Many Islands. So again, there's three distinct areas that these islands fall within. In Polynesia, probably the most famous islands are Hawaii, Tahiti, and Samoa. If you look at Melanesia, of course you have Australia, which is an island, but a continent too. Papua New Guinea, right, and Irian Jaya. And in Micronesia, you have the Marianas in the Carolines. So again, just some of the islands that you might hear talked about most commonly when you're looking at this area. Because this is an island-based culture, there's going to be a sort of different attitude here as far as their cultural cohesion. There's not much of it, because again, you have cultures existing island to island to island. So you have a lot of different cultural traditions in this area. You also have a vast array of dialects that are spoken here. Many people don't understand each other from island to island. And obviously their resources are going to be more limited. And with that limited resources also comes limited art pieces. So the way that art is made in other places, right, isn't going to be as typical here, because they're going to have less physical resources. They're going to have less wood, less stone, right, less stuff for art. So again, you're going to see a different attitude. Most of the art that they make ends up being pretty ephemeral, right, because of the kind of materials they're using, or art of the body, because again, they're using the canvases that are available to them, and often it's the body. So the focus of art making here is quite different than we've seen in the other cultures we've talked about. Now, the guiding principle of Pacific life is the concept of mana. And the concept of mana is basically a sacred power. And they believe that this power is in everything around you, and that it can be passed down to your descendants. It can be basically added up over time, and be used in the culture almost like as a physical presence. So the mana, or the sacred power, is something that they think is very, very important and is in all things around them. Obviously for us, this is going to be very important because it's going to impact our discussion of the art. So I want you to understand mana and this idea of this sacred power. Now, we've talked about this idea in other cultures, like the kami to me is very similar, right? This idea of power in objects or power in places. We've seen this idea before. It's nothing new to us, but here in the Pacific, it really, really reigns supreme. And where do you find it in the Pacific? You find it in people, you find it in places, and you find it in objects. So of course, I'm going to show you things from all three categories to describe this idea of mana and how it inhabits, right, everything in the Pacific region. Now, there's also another vocab word that I think is important to know, which is tapu. And it's the idea of a state of restriction. Our English word of taboo, comes from tapu. It's one of the few words that in English comes from a Polynesian dialect. So there's not a lot of words that come from these Polynesian dialects into English, but taboo is one of them. And again, it comes from tapu. And in Pacific life, they believe that things with mana are covered by a state of restriction. They must be interacted with in a very sacred way. And that you're not just allowed to touch things that have mana in them. They're again placed into a state of tapu. So the way I kind of try to describe this when I'm in class, if I'm wearing a piece of jewelry, I say, imagine that this necklace or this bracelet or whatever I have on, this ring, always say, imagine if this bracelet or this necklace has mana in it. It has power. You wouldn't be able to come right up to me and touch it. That would be breaking tapu or breaking the state of restriction, it would be considered quite bad manners, right, in Pacific culture. So this idea of, you're not supposed to, break that state of restriction. If somebody did break the state of restriction, the tapu, they could lower the mana of that object. So again, there would be a set of rules in a sense, or order revolving around, right, the idea of what has mana, what you do not interact with, right, and understanding the tapu of their culture. And again, for us today, we say, oh, that's taboo, you don't do that, right? So that word comes from tapu. The first category of mana is to find it in people. And as somebody who has been part of the piercing and tattoo crowd my whole life, I always love this discussion because, tattooing, piercing, all these kind of body arts, as we call them, they go back a long, long way. You find them here in the Pacific, you find them in Africa, you find them in a lot of different places. Because people of these cultures, because they didn't have a lot of physical resources, they often used their body as a canvas for art. And they believed very strongly that your body could amass mana or amass power by putting designs on the body. For instance, the idea of tattooing, right, being linked to, again, using the body as a canvas, right? That the body, in a sense, is the canvas. And, this idea of tattooa, right, the tattoos, right, being something that holds a lot of power. It almost becomes a sacred ritual to them. The warriors of these tribes, here you're seeing a Morai warrior. The warriors of these tribes, right, they literally use their body as a way to amass the mana or amass the power. You'll notice that they have full body tattoos, right? Their entire body, right, is covered with these tattoos that are often aligned with their physical appearance. And they believe very strongly that by covering the body with the tattoos, that they're creating, in a sense, armor, right, for them. We know that when these warriors are taken in battle, in this culture, they often were cannibalized because the opposing troops would believe very strongly that the mana of the body had to be consumed, it had to be ingested, it had to be used as a powerful force in and of itself for them to gain. So when we look at these tattoos, I always say, you have to think kind of about this idea that amongst the warriors, they often would have cannibalistic practices where eating the skin where the tattoos were would be a way for them to ingest their opponent's power, their mana. So, they're very serious, right, about how they use these tattoos, almost like as a form of armor or a form of power that they wore, in a sense, on their body, quite literally. And, again, the idea of tattooing is an art form in and of its own right to them, right? It's something that brands them of their tribe and of their people, and advertises, right, in a sense, their allegiance, right, with their culture. But today, we kind of look at tattoos as like, oh, it's just something kind of, it's like a neat design you might get. Some people aren't very serious about their tattoos, but people who get really serious tattoos, they're usually looking back to this culture, this cultural idea, right, of having a brand on your body that, in a sense, is about amassing power, right, amassing symbology for you, that's meaningful, right, to you and your culture. So, again, a lot of people I know who have tattoos, they've thought quite hard about what they wanted to put on their body because they knew it's permanent, right, it's part of their skin. So, and they think of it almost like, I think, as a kind of armor in and of its own right in a lot of ways. I love this photo of the Morai warrior, right? The ceremonial dances that they do today for tourists. And again, you can look at the totality of his body and really get a sense of, again, how they would use their body as a canvas, and they would think of these things as armor on their bodies. Yeah, it's a very active, energetic, right, way to create these pieces. And one of the things when you look at colonialism that's interesting to consider is that when colonialists or Europeans showed up in these regions, mainly in Polynesia with the French arriving, that they had to really kind of consider what tattoos were for these people. And they saw them as something that they should try to mitigate its power in a sense, right? They should try to downplay, right, the power of the tattoo. And so often what they did is take this positive thing that for instance, like for the New Zealander, Morais, right, was very powerful to them, and make it into something negative. So you'll notice on the left, it's a Morai tribesman dressed in more colonial clothes with his full face tattoos. And on the right, you have a woman with murderer written on her face, tattooed on her face. And notice it's written in such a way that she can read it in the mirror, so it can always be condemning her in a sense. Um, but the idea of almost like taking the chin tattoos you saw in some of the pictures of the Morai women and taking the tattoo and infusing it with a negative principle. Most Europeans, when they arrived here, they thought of tattoos as something negative. They were usually used as ways to mark criminals. So when they encountered a lot of Pacific people with tattoos, it went against their comprehension of what a tattoo was. They saw it as a negative thing. So again, you have these cultures kind of colliding with each other and thinking two different ways about tattooing and its practice. Another thing you can see quite a bit in Pacific culture, of course, is the body art of scarification. And scarification is just that. It's basically using brands or needles or, different types of items to either burn the body or poke the body in order to create these elaborate scars that then become patterns. Um, Probably the most famous scarifiers, right, live in the Sepik River area of Papua New Guinea. So you're seeing some of them here. And they're known for what they call the crocodile scarification method, where their patterns, they try to sort of mimic the idea of the scales of a crocodile. Here you can see them doing the scarification, right? And I would say with both scarification and tattooing, these are bloody, painful, elaborate, time-consuming processes. If you've ever seen anyone get a traditional tattoo, it basically is dipping like a wooden spike, you know, needle, basically a wooden needle or spike or a bone needle or spike into the ink, and then jabbing the body over and over and over again. Today, if you get a tattoo, of course, it's a very very fast moving needle, but it still hurts. I know, I'll tell you, it still hurts. But imagine somebody coming at you with a wooden spike basically over and over and over again. I have friends with traditional tattoos that were done in Japan, and yeah, it's time consuming, it's laborious, it's painful. And so again, if you get these done traditionally, it's nothing to joke about. It's pretty serious business. And again, you're seeing here some of the dances done during the crocodile festivals that these people engage in. And again, the scars that they have are meant to mimic, right, the idea of the skin, right, of the crocodile. But notice that these are usually full body as well, right? They're done over the whole body. So they have a similarity to the tattooing practice of almost like wearing these things like armor, that these people believe it's almost like a clothing, right? And an accessory that they wear that, again, heightens their mana or heightens their power. And by the way, in the background, you have a very, very traditional tamboran house as well. So we'll talk a little bit about those later on. So just pointing that out right here as we see it. Some other photos of Aboriginal scarification. So these are Aborigines from Australia. A little bit of a different type of patterning than you see with the Papua New Guinea folk, right? So it's a little bit of a different type of scarification, but again, imagine what you have to go through to achieve a lot of these results that you see. We'll now next talk about places and objects.